So hopefully you've watched the Bozeman science video that goes over the different structures in the brain. On e-learning, under the testing materials, hopefully you went over the outcomes and objectives, and you should have noticed a page that looks kind of like this, that has a list of all of the structures on the brain that you need to be able to identify. So we're going to go through those right now, and it should be somewhat of a review if you've already watched the Bozeman video. So the first thing when we're looking at the brain is that we tend to think about this kind of large, wrinkly part of the brain here when somebody says brain, because that's what you see on the Halloween candies or things like that. But really this is just one big part of your brain, and it is important, but it's not ultimately the part that's keeping you alive. This big wrinkly part of the brain is called the cerebrum, and it is basically your thinking brain. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. There's another part of your brain that is not listed on the anatomy that you have to be able to identify, but you do need to know what it is, and that is called the limbic system. The limbic system is composed of several different parts of the brain that work together, and they are going to act as your emotional brain. So this is going to include some of the structures that are on your objectives for identification, like the frontal lobe, but it also includes some structures that you need to know, but not necessarily need to be able to find on a picture or a model. And that would include things like the amygdala, which is sort of your fear or anger center, and some other areas that we'll talk about in a bit. So let's clear this out here for a second and go over what we can see in this picture. So we said, first of all, that this large wrinkly part is the cerebrum. The cerebrum can be divided into two halves, and we call those hemispheres. So you have a left and a right hemisphere. In this picture, this image that you're looking at right now, you are looking at the left hemisphere, because the person, I'll try to turn it like this, so I'm facing the same way as the picture. So you're looking at the left side facing the same direction as that picture. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. Those hemispheres can be subdivided into lobes, and there are 4 lobes on each side. This kind of pink or orangish one up here is the frontal lobe. This bright pink here is actually part of the frontal lobe. This yellow is part of this green lobe, which is the parietal. The purple in the back is occipital. And this blue down here is temporal. Now, each of these lobes really regulates quite a few different parts of your brain function, but we're going to keep things really simple and give you the highlights for right now. Your temporal lobe is going to help me deal with auditory information. So that means hearing. It also plays a pretty big role in memories. If you've ever gotten whacked in the side of your head, maybe your ears rung for a bit because you overstimulated the temporal lobe. Your occipital lobe is for optics, so this is going to be visual information. And if you actually look at the eyes, you have a left eye and a right eye. They have an optic nerve that comes off the back, it crosses over to the opposite side of the body, and goes to the opposite side of your occipital lobe. The parietal lobe is a very important sensory part of your brain. So it helps you with things like touch and taste sensation. And then we have this large frontal lobe. This one's going to be busy. It's going to be for motor control. And remember, this is my thinking brain, the whole thing. So this is conscious control of motor actions. It's going to be responsible for emotional control, problem solving, and then there's the little area right underneath here, which is known as the prefrontal cortex. This part right here is responsible for consequential thinking. Basically, what will happen if I do something and I haven't been taught what will happen? So can I predict or think about what the consequences of my actions would be? Now, the brain develops somewhat in this direction. So we start here in the temporal lobe and it matures like this. Which makes sense if you think about a baby. One of the first things they can do is recognize mom and dad's voices. And then they can start to recognize faces and track somebody's movements. And then they're really big on sensory function, right? They want to touch everything, grab everything, touch your hair, touch things that are soft or sharp or what have you. And then we get to the frontal lobe and we start to see them gain some ability to move and walk and crawl, pinch or grasp and pick things up. They start to get emotional control, although I'm not 100% convinced that that ever completely develops in some people, and I am one of those included. Your problem solving develops, and then the last thing to develop is that prefrontal cortex and my consequential thinking. And what's interesting is the most recent studies indicate that your prefrontal cortex may not really be fully developed until your late 20s or early 30s. And then if you think about that, when can I drive a car? Well, you might immediately have said, well, 16. That's not true. You can start your driver's ed lessons at 14 years and 8 months. I know this because my daughter just turned 13, and it's terrifying me to think less than 2 years she'll be in a car, driving it. So we can drive at 16. You can purchase cigarettes or vote at 18. You can purchase alcohol at 21. And we're nowhere near having that part of our brain really ready to make as good a decisions as we will be able to make when we're older. Now, I want to make a quick point here. That does not mean that just because I'm in my 30s or 40s, I can make good decisions and good consequential thinking. And it also does not mean that just because I am 18, I cannot make good consequential thinking. What it means is that my 16-year-old brain will not be as good as my 30-year-old brain at doing that. All right, now if we clear this out again here real quick. So we had the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. This squiggly ridge right here is part of your frontal lobe. Now all of these ridges are called gyri, or a gyrus would be singular. So you have one gyrus or several gyri. Those grooves or indentations between those ridges, like here and here and here, those are called sulci, or a sulcus is singular. So this pink ridge here is a specific gyrus that is part of your frontal lobe, and this is the precentral gyrus. And this is your primary motor center. So if I damage my left precentral gyrus, I won't be able to move the right side of my body. The ridge right behind that, here, is part of my parietal lobe, and this would be my post-central gyrus, here. And because it's part of the parietal lobe, this is my primary sensory center. If I damage my left post-central gyrus, I cannot feel on the right side of my body. And then this groove that runs right between the two of them is a sulcus here. And it cuts the brain or the cerebrum almost in half. So this is my central sulcus, and it's just separating the frontal and parietal lobes. So the ridge right in front of that precentral gyrus, or right in front of the central sulcus, is my precentral gyrus, and the ridge right behind my the ridge right behind my central sulcus is my postcentral gyrus. So the central sulcus is the groove that separates frontal from parietal lobes. In front of it is the precentral gyrus, which is motor, and behind it is the postcentral gyrus, which is sensory. So we'll stop there, and when we come back, we'll go over the rest of the structures of the brain.